Hi, I'm Ernie, and today I'd like to tell you a scuba diving story from the days of my youth. In 1984, I was working in Guam, and a popular hobby of friends of mine and coworkers was to go scuba diving. And I was a certified scuba diver, but when I got to Guam, I was amazed at the quality of diving that you could do there. Just the wildlife and World War II wrecks and just everything was just fantastic. So really enjoyed scuba diving. Now I had a friend who also enjoyed scuba diving, and his nickname was Frenchie. Frenchie was French Canadian, and he had a strong French Canadian accent. And he also owned a very small boat, a powered boat that he would tow around on a trailer behind his Subaru. And he would take friends of his, and we would go out and use this boat and do all kinds of open water dives and get to areas that you just couldn't really do from entering from the shore. Now, one of the popular attractions, one of the dive locations that a lot of us enjoyed diving on, was in Apra Harbor in Guam. And this was a double wreck. So there were two ships from two separate world wars that were sunk in Apra Harbor. And they were actually sunk almost right on top of each other. So it was a double wreck. Now, the older ship was a German freighter named the SMS Cormoran, and it was anchored in Apra Harbor in 1917, right at the outbreak of World War I. Now, when the German captain got news of Germany being at war with the Americans, he was fearful that the Americans would find and capture his ship, and this he didn't want. So he decided to scuttle his ship. So he did that, and the SMS Cormoran sank in about 120 feet of water in Apra Harbor. Fast forward to World War II, there was another ship, a Japanese freighter named the Tokai Maru. It was anchored almost directly above this old sunken German ship in Apra Harbor. In 1947, it was spotted by an American submarine that was on patrol. The submarine could see the ship from the entrance of the harbor, and it decided to send 4 torpedoes into her. They struck, and the Tokai Maru sank and landed nearly on top of the SMS Cormoran. These two ships actually lie almost keel to keel, stern to stern, in 120 feet of water. So this was a very popular dive site. If you had a boat, you could head out to the middle of this harbor and tie on to a marker buoy that was actually chained to the Tokai Maru. And you're real easy to find, and you can just follow the chain down to the wreck, and you could crawl all over the superstructures of both ships, and that was a really, really fun dive. On this particular day, Frenchie told us that he wanted to actually go inside the Tokai Maru. He wanted to penetrate this dive and go down into the engine room, and his intent was to remove some kind of souvenir, possibly a gauge that had Japanese writing on it, and keep it for himself. I believe this is prohibited, but this is something that he wanted to do. So he invited Tim and I, two of his friends, to go with him on this dive. So we arrived at Apra Harbor and we launched his small boat and we motored out to the marker buoy and tied onto it. And we donned our gear, entered the water, and dove down to the Tokai Maru. Now the Tokai Maru sits on its side, and we could see that there was a large opening in its deck right over what we would assume to be the engine room. Someone else had earlier tied a rope onto the outside railing of the Tokai Maru, and it went down through this opening and tied onto something down in the engine room. So all three of us had our dive lights, and we followed this rope to its end in the engine room, and we had our lights on, and Frenchie decided he needed to go much further into the engine room to see if he could locate a gauge to take as a souvenir. So we followed Frenchie, and he led us around catwalks and pipes and equipment and got down to some pretty tight spaces, and finally he found something that he wanted. So he went to work. He had some simple tools with him in his vest, and he started to try to remove this gauge while Tim and I just waited. Now, in that depth, 120 feet, 110 feet of water, our bottom time would be about 10 minutes. All three of us had 80 cubic foot aluminum tanks, and we knew that we were good for about 10 minutes with just a little bit extra to save for a very short decompression at 15 feet at the end of the dive. So I was watching my watch, watching the time, while Frenchie went to work and Tim was close by. And at about 7 minutes, I decided time's up. Frenchie isn't going to get this thing today. So I tugged on his flipper and got his attention, and when he turned to look at me, I was a little bit lower in the water than him. I pointed at my watch, telling him, Frenchie, time. So he gave me one of these, indicating he acknowledged, and he turned back around and he went right back to work. So I glanced over at Tim, and Tim just gave me one of these, like, what up? And I nodded, and I thought to myself, I'll let this go another 30 or 40 seconds. So I did. And at that point, I tugged harder on Frenchie's flipper. And annoyed, he looked back at me, and very adamantly this time, time, Frenchie, time. He did this again. So I shook my head very strongly back and forth. No, no. And yanked on his ankle. Time to go, Frenchie. So he gave up. So he came down and joined Tim and I at our level, and with our dive lights, we started to follow Frenchie back out. Time to exit the wreck. Well, what we hadn't counted on was there was a layer of rusty silt all on the bottom of this engine room. And with the ship actually resting on its side, I guess this would have been maybe the side of the hull. While we had been mainly stationary, we had still been slowly kicking our fins and our flippers just to sort of hold position and whatnot. Well, this stirred up this layer of silt, this rusty silt, and it started to kind of rise up and swirl around in the water and cloud things pretty considerably. But none of us really gave any thought to it. We could see each other just fine, and we had our dive lights, so no problem. Well, Frenchie's leading us out and maneuvering through the pipes and the equipment and whatnot, and he came to a dead end. And it surprised all of us. And he turned back around and started to go past me in another direction, and I looked at Tim, and Tim's eyes were this big, and I imagine mine were too. And time is running out. So Frenchie went off in a different direction and maneuvered around some equipment, and I sort of hung out with Tim, and no, he's coming back. That wasn't the way out either. And this cloudy water from all of this silt just made it much more difficult to maneuver down there. So I knew we were really running out of time. We couldn't go straight up. The ship was resting on its side. So I did this to Tim, as if to say, just hang tight. And I turned around and put my back to Tim and to Frenchie, and I turned my dive light off. And it made everything a lot darker the way I was facing. And I said a little prayer. Oh Lord, please save us. Please get us out of this wreck. So as I sat there, motionless, facing into the dark, I started to see this faint green glow appear as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. And I knew that was daylight. That was some kind of an opening. So I turned back to Tim and I went, come on. And Tim got Frenchie's attention and he joined us, and I led the way up and around some catwalks and whatnot up toward this green glow. And sure enough, it was a small hatch. Not the way we had come in, but that was the way we were going out. This hatch was just big enough for one person at a time. So through the hatch I went, followed by Tim, followed by Frenchie. We ascended to 15 feet. All three of us were looking at our air gauge, sharing it, showing it to one another, and all three of us were in the red, nearly out. But we knew at 15 feet that if one of us suddenly ran out of air, the remaining 15 feet wouldn't be that big of a deal. So we hung out there for a minute or two, never did run out of air. The three of us popped up to the surface. Regulators came out, masks came up to our foreheads, and boy, was there some relief. A little bit of profanity and maybe a little bit of blaming, but we were thankful to get out of there alive. So we made it back to the boat, and that was the end of that dive. It was a great story to tell, and although we did dive those wrecks again later, we never did go inside of any of those wrecks. We had learned our lesson well. Thanks for listening.